Well, hello and welcome to our internet audience on behalf of the Bade Museum at Pacific School of Religion and the PEF, which Felicity will introduce. I'd like to welcome you all to our roundtable this morning, this afternoon, this evening, depending on where you are around the globe. I'll just take a moment to introduce myself and my institution. I'll go with the institution first. So I represent the Bade Museum at Pacific School of Religion, which is an archaeology museum built around a collection that actually will be featured kind of in the peripheral today, but based on the excavations of my predecessor at Pacific School of Religion, William F. Bade, who taught at the school from 1902 to 1936. And towards the later part of his career, excavated a site in Mandate Palestine. And we have some of the objects from those excavations, but all of the excavation records, which are really, I think, the treasure trove. And so it's wonderful having this exhibit and roundtable based on those archives. And I'm Aaron Brody. I teach at Pacific School of Religion and direct the Bade Museum. So I'm very pleased to hand the mic, so to speak, over to Felicity Cobbing, who will introduce herself and her institution.
Hello, I understand some people can't hear, but I think others can. So hopefully those issues will be sorted out. But I'm Felicity Cobbing and I represent the Palestine Exploration Fund in London. And we got involved in this project because Melissa and Sam put together a grant proposal for our annual research grants, which during the pandemic had been slightly altered to take the emphasis towards projects which could be completed without going into the field. And this archival online exhibition was absolutely perfect as a subject for this. And we were particularly impressed by the emphasis that the project wanted to put on giving a voice to those people who had been previously excluded from so much of our understanding of archaeology and archaeological practice in Palestine and the Middle East, and that is that of the local Palestinian workforce themselves and the communities in which they lived. And I feel very happy, actually, that this has really come to such a wonderful fruition. So I hope that you will enjoy this tour around the new exhibition.
Thank you, Felicity. So it's my pleasure to introduce my two staff members and colleagues who curated this online exhibit. So Melissa Craddock is curator at the Bade Museum and lecturer in History and Judaic Studies at SUNY Albany. She holds a National Endowment for the Humanities postdoctoral fellowship at the Getty Research Institute, where she will be based during this academic year. She has carried out archaeological fieldwork in the Mediterranean and Middle East for over a decade. In addition to the Bade Museum, Melissa has held curatorial, educational, and collections management roles at museums such as the Hearst Museum of Anthropology and Smithsonian Institution. She received her PhD in Ancient History and Mediterranean Archaeology from UC Berkeley, an MPhil in Archaeology from the University of Cambridge, and a BA in Archaeology and Classics from George Washington University. And her co-curator, Samuel Pfister, is the Bade Museum's collections manager and host of the archaeology channel of the New Books Podcast Network. He also works at a small business as a small business social media manager and event coordinator. He has participated in archaeological work in the state of Israel at Tel Megiddo and Tel Kabri, and received his BA in History and Archaeology and MA in Anthropology, both from George Washington University. He has previously conducted archival research at the Albright Institute in Jerusalem, the Palestine Exploration Fund, and the Diocesan Archives at Westminster. So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce both Melissa and Sam, who will take us on a virtual tour of their virtual exhibit. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Aaron and Felicity, for those introductions. So I'm just going to put into the chat the link to our web exhibit as Sam is sharing it on his screen. And as Aaron mentioned, I'm one of the curators of the exhibit along with Sam. And for the next couple of minutes, we'll be explaining what this archival exhibit is all about, and we'll be giving a brief virtual tour of some of the exhibit highlights. So I'm going to start by explaining the inspiration for the exhibit and its goals, and then Sam will focus on the archival sources themselves. So the original impetus behind the exhibit is that we were looking to develop new digital and online resources for public audiences. And the original plan was to digitize previous exhibits that had been on display in the museum's physical gallery space on the campus of the Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California. So for example, an exhibit a few years ago used photos and newspaper clippings to highlight the institutional history of the Palestine Institute, which later became the Bade Museum. And those same archival materials from the original gallery exhibit inspired the current iteration of the web exhibit that you're about to see. But we went in a slightly new direction and found different sets of archival sources in the collection that hadn't been seen before, that also delve more deeply into the original excavations at the site of Tel en-Nasbeh that were carried out in British Mandate Palestine from 1926 to 1935. And that's where the museum's collections come from. We were motivated to use this rich set of unpublished archives that only a handful of researchers and museum staff have seen up until now. And so we started to turn to asking questions about what the archives could show us about the history of the excavations, not only at Nasbeh, but also in British Mandate Palestine more broadly. The archival collections mainly consist of photographs, letters, receipts, and permits from the excavations at Nasbeh. So Sam and I created a narrative about the archaeological labor system from these sources, which was a bit of a gap in the field. And we primarily viewed these sources through the lens of the local Palestinian workers whose presence on the site appears only in the archives, and they're not otherwise acknowledged in the final publications. So the idea was to present a ground-up view that shifts the focus from the dig directors at the top of the hierarchy, and that's who often receives the most attention and praise in studies on the history of archaeology, and instead look at the people who actually carried out the digging. And in terms of the broader goals, beyond just making these unpublished archives visible and accessible to the public for the first time, we also aimed to curate a collection that would dialogue with recent scholarship that uses post-colonial approaches to archival collections and archaeology more generally. And these new projects, many of which you'll hear about in an upcoming lecture series that we'll be hosting later this year that will be announced at the end of today's event. Many of these new projects are shifting the focus from the American and European senior staff to the roles of these other players on the digs, like the local workers at the bottom of the hierarchy who haven't received much or really any attention. So it's a way of flipping the script of that traditional narrative and approach, and also a way of introducing some critique of the accepted norms of 20th century projects like those at Nasbeh. So that's exactly what we hope to accomplish with this exhibit, is a new focus on the contributions and the skills of those at the trowel's edge who have largely remained not only understudied, but who are also silent in the final publications from the site.
Right, so as Melissa said, this exhibit titled Unsilencing the Archives, the Laborers of the Tel en-Nasbeh Excavations, presents merely a snapshot of the experience and the legacy of the Palestinian as well as the Egyptian workers who excavated and performed another number of other essential tasks for the archaeological dig at the site of Tel en-Nasbeh, which is approximately 12 miles north of Jerusalem between the years 1926 and 1935. So this exhibit is designed using material from the extensive documentary and photographic archives at the Bade Museum at the Pacific School of Religion. The archive at the Bade Museum is really unique in its completeness. The collection has moved physically very little over the past 100 years and has managed to maintain a very low profile among Middle Eastern archaeology museums in North America. And so the collection itself has seen very little study, relatively little study. The dig at en-Nasbeh was really prolific in its use of photography and has one of the most comprehensive collections of archaeological photography from that time. In many cases, the images and the quotes from letters and notes that are presented in this exhibit are really the first time that any of these are being seen or read or made public since their creation. And admittedly, this exhibit really still only scratches the surface of the tens of thousands of pages of documents and the thousands of photographs that are in this archive. So a lot more work has to be done. But to get into the actual content of the exhibit now, and I hope these transitions are a little seamless. So for much of the 20th century, archaeological excavations in the Middle East employed a model of labor whereby scores or even hundreds of local workers were organized into gangs or teams under the supervision of highly experienced foremen. And these gangs and teams undertook the bulwark of the physical excavation of the site. And as Melissa mentioned, representation in the archives is really not only the impetus for this exhibit, but also it's one of the main drawbacks in developing this exhibit and in reconstructing the history. There was a rather rigid hierarchy in archaeological labor, and one's place in this hierarchy roughly correlates to degrees of representation in the archive. It was common practice in Mandate Palestine to hire trained field workers or trained supervisors from Egypt as foremen to oversee the excavations. And so 8 of these highly trained men worked at en-Nasbeh over the course of 5 seasons. And you can scroll through and read a bit of their biographies that we were able to mine from the archives in section 1 of this exhibit. One of them was a man named Abdul Rahman Gabel, and he initially joined the en-Nasbeh project in 1926 for its first season on the recommendation of archaeologist Clarence Fisher, who was the director of the excavation at Megiddo. Gabel was promoted to head foreman in 1932, and each year he returned to en-Nasbeh from his home of Kuft in Egypt. His travel was sponsored by the expedition. So part of this exhibit traces the route that these men took from their homes in Egypt to Palestine each season, and showing the receipts and the letters from their travel. And although these men are lauded very heavily by Bade and other contemporary archaeologists, few make it into the official publications from the excavations on which they worked, and are often sort of anonymized as the reis or the foreman. So section 1 of this exhibit will introduce you to many of the men who worked as foremen at Tel en-Nasbeh, while section 3 will provide a little more specifics on some of the roles that they played. And hopefully it loads here. Great, yeah.
Yeah, we're going to go to section 2 now, which is called the Dig House. And this section covers the day-to-day activities and the living environment of the dig staff, who rented 2 different houses, one for the American staff who were based in Ramallah, which they rented from fellow archaeologist Clarence Fisher, and then the main dig house on site, which you see here, which is called Malufia, which is named after its owner, Rachel Maloof. And Malufia was used for storage, as office space, for pottery restoration, and to house the Egyptian foremen during the dig season. But the division between the 2 dig houses, one in Ramallah and one on site called Malufia, has created a bit of an upstairs-downstairs dynamic that separated the Americans from everybody else. This section also addresses the rental contracts for the properties, so including both of those residences and the land of Tel en-Nasbeh itself. These properties were owned by local residents of El Bira, which is the town where en-Nasbeh is located, and several different people owned different parcels of the Tel. And we'll see a few of those people in these images as Sam scrolls through. So the exhibit goes into the delicate navigation of those local politics that were required to negotiate those leases. And the archives include payment and lease agreements covering the land for different years of excavation, as well as compensation for the loss of crops not planted, as this was mainly agrarian land used for planting crops and grazing livestock, which wouldn't be possible for the villagers and farmers to do during the active excavation. And we also found that ultimately approval and help came from the British government authorities who are running the Ramallah district and the Department of Antiquities of the British government of Palestine, who had the final say in these lease agreements. And that situation gave the El Bira landowners little recourse to oppose or resist these agreements once the excavation permit had been authorized. So now we're going to move from section 2 to section 3, which is called Invisible Labor. And this is really the core of the exhibit, and it draws from film and photo archives to piece together the overarching story of the laborers who worked at en-Nasbeh. And we also use some of the published material that appears in Bade's 1934 Field Manual of Excavation, like the quote that you see in italics at the top of the screen there, that gives his perspective on the foreman, and I'll let you glance over that yourself. This section was particularly challenging because we don't actually have the voices of the workers speaking directly. The only person whose written words we have is Labib Sorial, who was a highly educated member of staff and who occupied a special role in the project, and the exhibit goes into his role a bit. We just don't have time to cover it right now. And the other lone voice, of course, is that of Bade himself, who often took a patronizing tone when discussing his skilled staff, like the foreman, as we see here, where he disparages them despite heaping praise on them elsewhere, as Sam noted. So there's a bit of a contrast between what appeared in print and what appeared in the letters in terms of his attitude towards the workers. So we made an effort to highlight that attitude, which was couched in the colonial context of Bade's time. And the goal here wasn't just to critique, but to shine a light on how this attitude misrepresented the actual skills and contributions of these highly trained and experienced field supervisors. And their skills and responsibilities were similar in today's terms. For those of you familiar with field archaeology, they were similar to that of an area or a trench supervisor. For example, they were trained in delicate trowel work, like Reis, who excavated an oven, and here we have Abdul Fattah, who's excavating a tomb. They also had to manage and train large groups of less skilled workers, often 20 to 30 people at a time. And they had to determine what kinds of actions to take on a minute-by-minute basis to excavate a context. So a lot of the decision-making power actually rested on their shoulders, and that's an important point that we're trying to draw out. Some of them also had special training in pottery restoration, like Reis Mahmoud Karim, who you see here, as well as Reis Berberi, who are shown on film in the next slide, restoring a large storage jar in 1929. And I really encourage you to take the time to watch this film. It's between 2 and 3 minutes long of a reel just showing them from beginning to end restoring this large jar. So we have this rich record, but there are gaps in the evidence. So for example, in Bade's field manual, he mentions specially skilled workers, especially in terms of pottery, but he doesn't name them. And in fact, none of the foremen is identified by name in any of the final publications. So these gaps leave us with reading between the lines of the photographic record mainly to recreate the narrative of what their roles and contributions actually were. And these records are also virtually silent on the contributions of women and children who comprised a large segment of the workforce. Children were hired to carry out some of the difficult physical labor, like hauling heavy baskets filled with dirt. And they also washed a lot of the pottery. And we know of the presence of women and children only from photos that show them engaged in these tasks. Part of the reason that they're silent in the records is perhaps that women and children employees were undervalued as workers. We don't have direct evidence to that, but this is sort of indirect interpretation. So the records don't mention their working conditions or even what their pay was like compared to adult men, but in all likelihood, it was low wage and they were probably paid less than the others. And on that note, I'll transition back to Sam, who will speak a little bit more on the issue of wages and pay.
Sure, thank you, Melissa. So as Melissa mentioned, the financial relationship between an excavation and the landowners and nearby villages was very complex and often contentious. This was sometimes exacerbated by labor competition over the meager seasonal wages that were paid to laborers. An individual's pay for work on an archaeological excavation at the time depended on a number of factors, including their role and responsibility at the dig, their duties and their tasks performed that week, the determined quality of their work, gender, age, and much more. Standard pay was typically issued very weekly, and here you can see a colorized image of some of the workers waiting outside of the Malufia dig house, waiting for their pay. Workers also received what are known as Bakshish Payments, which are essentially rewards for finding and returning to one's supervisor particularly interesting archaeological material. Bakshish fines were recorded and paid alongside standard wage at the end of the week. And there are a number of problematics with bakshish, that mode of payment. Namely, although encouraging attention to fine work, as it encouraged the discovery of finds, it had a more detrimental effect on scientific archaeology in that it assigned monetary value to antiquities and provided a base standard by which forgers and looters and others peddling antiquities on the illicit market could cite and refer to sort of burgeon their own trade. Laborers were mainly hired from towns nearby the excavation, nearby the dig. And the surplus supply of labor and the attractiveness of immediate wages meant that laborers had very little power to organize in any meaningful way, and their status on the dig was very precarious. This precarity is emphasized in one encounter between a man named Hamad, who claimed to represent the underemployed young men of the town of El Bira, as well as Bade. Hamad petitioned Bade to hire more workers from El Bira, to which the land of Tel en-Nasbeh belongs, and made some fairly strong demands in his initial letter. Bade didn't receive this well at all and refused him, insisting that he's going to continue to hire the workers that he's been working with for several years at that point from the town of Ramallah. Bade also then reported Hamad to the Department of Antiquities after a further exchange of letters, and then the department censored him and forced him to write an apology. This like a very tantalizing end to this encounter. And so this incident highlights, well, first off, this exchange of letters shows the delicate position that a lot of workers were in on the excavation. Laborers could be terminated for any number of real or perceived transgressions and be very easily quickly replaced. But this incident also highlights the way that the Mandate government apparatus, including the Department of Antiquities, heavily favored foreign archaeologists over local Palestinians when labor disputes did arrive. So I would encourage you to look through this section very carefully. There's a number of different anecdotes that really highlight the complex nature of the relationship between excavations and the local towns that they were situated nearby. And so I'll pass it back to Melissa now.
Yeah, just a very brief conclusion to invite everyone to check out the exhibit on your own. And we hope that the exhibit and these previously unseen archives together will contribute to the growing body of scholarship that's investigating issues of labor in early 20th century archaeology. And with that, I think that's a great way to transition to our panelist responses. So Felicity, I'm going to give it over to you.
Thank you very much, Melissa and Sam. That was fantastic for a really nice, quick whiz around what is a much more extensive overall exhibition. So it's my duty now to welcome our three panelists, Dr. Hamid Salem, Dr. Eric Klein and Allison Mickel, who are joining us now to respond to our lecture, our talk. So first of all, let me introduce Dr. Hamed Salem, who is Associate Professor in the Department of History and Archaeology at Birzeit University in Ramallah, and he teaches there Palestinian archaeology and cultural heritage to undergraduates, as well as supervising postgraduate students. His research interests within the context of Palestinian archaeology are very wide-ranging, from early Bronze Age villages in the West Bank to Byzantine churches, to Ottoman-era settlement systems and local chiefdoms. He has published on such topics as the archaeology of warfare in Ottoman Palestine and Palestinian traditional pottery. Dr. Salem has also focused on developing practical applications of digital technologies excuse me, in archaeology and cultural heritage, such as deploying 3D tools at the site of Jericho and developing strategies for sustainable inventories of a digital museum for Afghanistan. And he received his PhD in archaeology from Leiden University. So Dr. Salem, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. My apology for the images. I did not make it home, so I'm looking on it from somewhere. First of all, thank you all for inviting me and for allowing me to speak on this spectacular kind of exhibition. I like the idea that stated on the introduction that this is going to touch an issue that which is the people who work in the field, the workers and the staff members that actually are not the core, are not the academics or the Americans in this situation. And this is unusual for people just to not ignored for a while and touching the people that were ignored in history. I think this kind of projects that we need these days in the wake of the severe destruction of cultural heritage and archaeological sites, where people can see themselves as part of the protector of this cultural heritage rather than the looters, you know, in the future. And unfortunately, this was not happening with the expeditions. That was. Is my voice clear, or should? Can you hear me very well?
Yes, yeah, you're coming.
Because I cannot hear. But this is kind of things that we are looking for in any future project in terms of involving the workers. And this is what we at Birzeit we try to do, you know, to make the workers are part of our team, to make them understand what's going on, and to give them more intellectual motivation rather than give them bakshish, you know, because rarely we find anything. I think we need more community archaeology. This is what you are doing here on this exhibition. How the community was interacted on, how was it involved in this kind of project. I know that we can talk a lot about it, but I want to make some comments, you know, if you allow me on the exhibition. And this morning I visited en-Nasbeh for a long time. I have not been there, and I took some photos. So I will share it with you and see what's the current situation. I tried to get to the also some information about this very famous place now, which is, you know, what was hired by the expedition, and other kind of context. So I have, I think, 10 minutes. I hope I did not will keep in time. I see it's you know, the early excavation, this is a typical of the early excavation, 1920s, 1930s, and before that, where we use human bulldozers, started by Salem, you know, as everybody know, and Salem, Jericho, Talbalat, etc. Sultan, by using these human forces, and what we can call a human bulldozer to excavate these sites. And the exhibition rightfully pushed for the colonial aspect of this kind of interaction between the workers and the site. It's like they use them as machines only. Even if we read Bade's, you know, the manual in Bade stated like he wants to enforce laws and be severe with people who are lazy, and giving, you know, extra things for people who are work hard. As you know, he stated this kind of laws, but we know that the employment force is divided into 3 sections. We have first the Egyptians, or which is not local to Palestine, and this started a long time by sites like Tal Mutasallim, and especially as foreman, because they are a little bit experienced. And there is also certain colonial thing about it, because in this way they will assure the people, the local people will be controlled. You know, we know that this is the strategy was followed by the Ottoman, where they have, you know, when they're using the army, they have people from other countries serving on other places, so they cannot interact with them. So I think maybe this is one reason why the excavations, the early excavations was hiring Egyptians. Then we have, of course, local fallahin, and fallahin is the term exact villagers. It's common names. So they are hard workers sometimes, but the fallahin is not only for men. You know, we have women, and en-Nasbeh, as other places in Palestine, and I think the world, they saw oppression against these women. They give them, you know, the hard labor to carry the kuffa and do this kind of work. We know, for example, even archaeologists, female archaeologists at the time, with the exception of Dorothy Garwood and Judith Market Krauser Talital, and we know that this kind of female was facing real masculine kind of thinking. Dorothy Garwood was appointed as a professor, you know, at Cambridge 1930s, you know, because she really worked hard to gain this position, and this is unusual. So we can see this is kind of masculinity on the expedition side, and I think the exhibition has give us some data, some photos, where women are treated, carrying the kuffa, illustrations, beside also this. And of course, normally they never mentioned women. When I was reading your text, I was hoping to show me a picture where women was standing for line to get their bed directly, because in our society, usually women work and men get the money to get the bed. So in this, but I was really shown some evidence of that on this kind of context. I think I want to move a little bit, because many of you, of course, know what I'm talking about, but let let me show you something new that's en-Nasbeh in the Palestinian context of cultural heritage. Okay. I cannot see, it's very dark in here, so. Okay. I'm sharing the screen now or not?
Dr. Salem, it's not showing up as a shared screen.
Okay. Thank you. That's usually it's okay.
There we go.
I think now maybe.
Yes, yes.
I am sorry I could not make it as a PowerPoint, but yeah, okay, great. So this is the site. It's a fresh photo, so you are welcome to use it if you like. I can send it to you. Anyway, so this is the site of Al-Ma'lufiyya. You know, Al-Ma'lufiyya is coming from Ma'luf family. Ma'luf is mentioned in your documents, the correspondence between her and Bade, and she rented the house, which at the time you have another photo for it. Very nice photo, an old photo, but this is the new highway going from Jerusalem to Ramallah. In your photo, it was only one room. I think this is what remained from the room. And Ma'luf family is originally came to Palestine from Lebanon in 1897. They're originally Lebanese. Her father, Philip, was a doctor, and he just was asked by the Quakers to replace a British doctor at the time and work with the Palestinians. So they have this house. Now later on, it was rented to Jibril family, who turned it to a place where they can make arak. Everybody knows what's arak. Arak Ramallah is very famous. So this is the how do you call arak? Winery, something like making wine, but making the arak. And it's still making arak until today, but as you see, it was destroyed by time. Now coming back to en-Nasbeh, okay. Now this is the situation. This is one of the Bedouin family living at the site now. This is in this context is a typical Palestinian site where it's facing lots of destruction. First of all, of course, the negligence and normal collapse and destruction by weathering or by herding and by several activities, and second by looting. But there is some remains because luckily the Department of Antiquity, of course, asked Bade to bury the site, so we have a lot of hidden things. But what remains in the surface is facing direct 1930s, so it's a very long time. Now the other factor is this kind of buildings that you see. This kind of huge tower. This is built on the area controlled by the Israelis. The Israeli granted certain permits for these people to build randomly because they want to evacuate Jerusalem. So they encourage them to build this. But luckily enough, the site is protected also by several laws, which so people are standing aside. Otherwise, it can really be filled with this kind of huge towers. This is
I'm sorry, Dr. Salem, you're breaking up a little bit. I'm also
not following any standard. Now, the surface of the site is full of stones. You see, like this is, the internet is not I couldn't hear you.
I'm sorry, just you were breaking up a little bit. And just for the concern of time, do you mind just kind of wrapping things up, please?
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. I was saying, so I'm just want to show you a few, some pictures, but of loot, etc. But this is one of the trenches that looters came. So I see, and I want to see. I think one thing that I want to focus is that many of these excavation has made since 1947 and the discovery of Qumran. You know, scrolls and this big stories coming in the news, and people discover that archaeology is a source of funding. So as Samuel mentioned, this kind is about the cultural heritage and the destruction of archaeological sites. And I would like to see this more evidence for this on the excavation. You know, Bakshish is a term, is a Turkish name, of course. So it's known in the Turkish system of giving money to tourists and foreigners. And but not used in our culture. You know, it's only culture used for outside. They will not ask me for bakshish, for example. But this kind of system is a system where people has to do things to gain money, not always being dug. I think it will be stopped one day. Thank you. I'm sorry to take some time, but the main highlight.
Thank you so much. I think Felicity will now introduce our second panelist. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Salem. Lots of interesting things to think about. I'm also particularly interested in this relationship between the Kuftis from Egypt and the local Fellaheen, local Palestinians, and how they interacted and what dynamics are taking place there. So on to our next panelist, who is Eric Klein. And he is Professor for Classics, History and Anthropology, and is the former chair of the Department of Classical and Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations and the current director of the Capitol Archaeological Institute at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. A National Geographic explorer, NEH public scholar, Getty scholar, and Fulbright scholar with degrees from Dartmouth, Yale, and the University of Pennsylvania. He is an active field archaeologist with more than 30 seasons of excavation and survey experience in Israel, Egypt, Jordan, Cyprus, Greece, Crete, and the United States, including 10 seasons at Megiddo. Is there anywhere this man hasn't been? There, where he also served at Megiddo as co-director before retiring from the project in 2014, and another 10 seasons at Tel Kabri, where he currently serves as co-director. He is the author or editor of 20 books and nearly 100 articles. Translations of his books have appeared in 19 different languages. And I conclude, therefore, that Eric is a vampire and doesn't sleep. Over to you, Eric.
Thank you very much, Felicity. Can you all hear me and can you all see my screen? Is it sharing properly? Okay, wonderful. So thank you all very much. I've been asked to give my response to the online exhibit, as well as to help place it in context a bit, and then to discuss my own recent work on related topics. So let me begin by first thanking the organizers for the invitation to take part today, and then congratulating everyone involved in the creation of these online web pages, which I think are absolutely superb. And kudos to Melissa and Sam for doing this and everyone else involved. Now, we are very fortunate that the Bade Museum of Biblical Archaeology has all of these materials in its archives, so that Melissa and Sam could retrieve all of the information about the Guftis and give them recognition for their efforts, even if it is overdue by nearly a century. And we're fortunate also that William Bade saw fit to take photographs of the individual Guftis each year, thereby documenting their presence each season. I wish that we were so lucky with the parallel situation at Megiddo, which I've been working on and about which I will say a few words in a moment. Now, all of these workmen are what Stephen Quirk has called hidden hands on excavations. This comes from his 2010 book of the same title, which I believe was the first instance in recent years that attempted to restore these workers to their rightful place in the annals of archaeology. They are an example of invisible labor, as it's defined by anthropologists and sociologists, who say that this is activities that occur within the context of paid employment that workers perform, yet are often overlooked. Now, other scholars followed Quirk with studies of their own, calling attention to these unsung laborers who formed the backbone of the excavation teams that were led not only by Petrie, but also by other archaeologists working in Egypt, British Mandate Palestine, Transjordan, from the 1880s until the beginning of World War II, and then beyond. And these other scholars, some of whom I see in our participants today, include Wendy Doyen, Jack Green and Ross Henry, Sarah Irving, Allison Mickel, who will respond after me, Joanne Rowling, Rachel Sparks, and Alice Stevenson, among others. And I believe that Peter Dermanuelian, Emily Teeter, and Jeff Zorn are all also working on similar projects. And now, of course, we have this marvelous exhibit that Melissa and Sam have put together, and that has just set the standard and the bar which we must all meet as well in future endeavors. Now, as I've mentioned, I've been doing something similar for the Guftis who worked at Megiddo during basically the same years as these Guftis at en-Nasbeh, though for a slightly longer stretch. They were at Megiddo from 1925 to 39. I've only been doing it as words on paper, not with a brilliant multimedia extravaganza such as we have here. The similarities and parallels at Megiddo to en-Nasbeh are really interesting. But unfortunately, the staff at Megiddo did not pay as much attention to documenting their Guftis, so that we don't have individual photographs for them like you do at en-Nasbeh. For me, I'm usually limited to photographs of workmen taken at a distance, or let's see, well, there we go. Hold on, it skipped one here. Actually, there we go. Or a picture of the Megiddo staff and workmen from 1926. Although this one does have the names of everyone written on the back, including all of the Guftis, as well as the Chicago team members. Now, moreover, I don't know why this isn't advancing. It should be. Sorry about this. There we go. Moreover, although there were more than 50 of these Egyptian workmen at Megiddo, only a few of them are mentioned in the preliminary and final publications that are produced by the project, just like at en-Nasbeh. All of the Egyptian workmen who worked up on top of the tell at Megiddo, doing the actual excavating or overseeing the local villagers who were hired to dig and then haul away the dirt, were a crucial part of the team. While the Chicago staff members did most or all of the surveying, the planning, the mapping, the photographing, and the other recording and paperwork that accompanied the discovery of both the buildings and the artifacts, it was the Guftis who were the foremen and responsible for the hard physical manual labor of the actual digging. Without them, 15 straight years of survey and excavation would not have been possible, and there would have been no need for the staff from Chicago. And yet, one certainly wouldn't know from their publications just how indebted the Chicago staff were to the Egyptian workmen. They, along with the local villagers, are very much the invisible excavators of the site. In any effort to reconstruct the lives and labors of these Egyptian workmen and the local villagers, we are now at the mercy of what can be found in the various archival sources. Most of the information that I was able to find is online on the archives for the Israel Antiquities Authority within their material from the British Mandate period, as well as more information from the archives of the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, which I was able to retrieve with the help of the chief archivist, Anne Flannery, and others. I pulled the names and the details of who was at Megiddo each season from requests for half-price third-class railway vouchers for travel between Kantara and Haifa for specific workmen each season, from field diary entries, from black and white photographs, and occasional mentions in budgets or within letters that were sent back and forth between Megiddo and Chicago. From this fragmentary information, I was able to piece together at least a partial picture of these unsung members of the expedition, some of whom were present at Megiddo for more seasons than the ever-rotating members of the Chicago staff themselves. And ultimately, as you can see on the right here, I was able to create a spreadsheet of the workmen and the years that they worked at Megiddo. There were lots of interesting problems, such as when I had evidence that someone went to Megiddo at the beginning of the season, but wasn't then mentioned in the list of people heading home at the end of the season. But in the end, I was able to create what I think is a fairly accurate timeline for each person. And along the way, I grew to know, at least partially, some of the major players like Reis Hamid, Ali the potmender, as they called him, Ali's assistant Mahmoud, Abu Yusuf the rodman, Salama the photographer's assistant, and others. I was able to follow their comings and goings at the site. I was able to figure out when Ali stayed at Megiddo over the winter break or the summer vacation, working on mending the pottery instead of going home, and so on. However, I'm left to wonder about many other things. For instance, I have absolutely no idea how many of the Chicago staff members could speak Arabic and could communicate directly with the Egyptian workmen and the local laborers. And vice versa, apart from Labib Soriel and probably William Gadd, who were at Megiddo in the early years before they stormed off the excavation in 1927 and went to en-Nasbeh to keep working there. I don't know how many of the other Egyptian workmen or the local villagers spoke English. Such details are never mentioned in any of the records that we now have. And for that matter, as was kind of mentioned just now, we also don't know what the interactions between the Guftis and the local villagers were like. Did they get along? Was there any interaction? Was there resentment by one group or another? Did the Guftis keep to themselves when they weren't working, or did they spend time interacting with the locals? And we know next to nothing about the local villagers, who sometimes numbered in the hundreds during the dig season. I rather doubt that there was much interaction between the two groups, but unfortunately there are no hints or clues in the extant records. Hold on. Keeps jumping ahead here, apologies. And I'm almost done.
If you could
yes,
wrap things up, that would be great.
I will wrap up.
Thank you.
Okay, yes. Apart from a few photographs, when we see special occasions like the celebrations, as we see here, I also don't know what the Egyptian workmen did at Megiddo when they weren't working. What did they do in the evenings? How did they entertain themselves? Were they in contact with loved ones back home through letters or other messages? We know these details for the Chicago staff members precisely because we have their personal letters and dig diaries, but we don't have such items for the Egyptian workmen. With so many questions left to answer, it's clear that what I've done so far is just the first step at Megiddo in bringing back to life the Guftis that work there, just like Melissa and Sam have done for those who work at en-Nasbeh. And future steps would ideally include trying to find their descendants and contacting them to see if they have any relevant materials or stories. In sum, the Guftis that worked at Megiddo and those who worked at en-Nasbeh and elsewhere have indeed been hidden hands until now, as Stephen Quirk called them, or invisible excavators, as I have labeled them. And you can see Ali in the very background here of a staff picture, but they don't need to be invisible anymore. By continuing to construct a more comprehensive picture of the accomplishments of these workmen at en-Nasbeh, Megiddo, and elsewhere, we can try to restore them now to their rightful place in the history of the archaeology that's been conducted in this part of the world. So congratulations again on this wonderful exhibit, and thank you for including me in this panel discussion today.
Thank you very, very much, Eric. That was fascinating and a really timely look inside the archives from another excavation at Megiddo, one that was contemporary with those at Tel en-Nasbeh, shared some of the same features. And it gives us an idea about some of the challenges that these archival records place when you're trying to put together a narrative, an idea about, you know, what the local population, how they were involved and what kind of experiences they had in these projects. So thank you again. We move on now to our third panelist, who is Professor Allison Mickel. And she is Assistant Professor of Anthropology in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology and a core faculty member in both Global Studies and the Center for Global Islamic Studies. Her research focuses on how local communities have been impacted and have been infected by the long history of archaeological world in the Middle East, centering in particular on questions about labor and knowledge production. Her new book, Why Those Who Shovel Are Silent, with a fantastic picture on the front, I have to say, I love that. A History of Local Archaeological Labour and Knowledge, was published in March 2021, and it reveals how archaeological excavations rely on the expertise that locally hired site workers possess about archaeological remains and methodologies. She has excavated in Jordan, Turkey, Kenya, and the United States, and is now undertaking an ethnographic project centering on 2 new private companies in Jordan advocating for the recognition of local expertise and fair labour conditions on archaeological excavations. She has earned fellowships from Fulbright, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Center of Research, and the Biblical Archaeological Society to support her research. And she received her PhD in anthropology from Stanford University and her BA from the College of William and Mary. Thank you, Allison, over to you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm also going to respond to the exhibit. I'm really grateful to the other panelists who have explored a lot of important angles relevant to this exhibit. My comments actually start in a kind of unusual place. I want to start by talking about the movie Candyman, actually, that came out recently. I don't know if it's come out worldwide, but it certainly came out recently in the U.S. It was a remake of an earlier horror movie. The new one is by Jordan Peele. And it might seem like a strange jumping off point, but Candyman is essentially a movie about an archives. It's about oral history. It is a ghost story about memory. The premise of the movie is that the Black community from Cabrini Green in Chicago, it's like a historically under-resourced neighborhood. This community tells stories of violence and trauma that are so powerful that their collective memory creates a physical instantiation. There's a ghost that comes to life, enters people's homes through their mirrors, and actually kills them. And that's the power that this movie proposes of collective memory and storytelling. It's putting out the idea that the oral archive is powerful enough to produce the physical reality of the Candyman in this case. And the way that you call the Candyman is that you look in a mirror and you say his name 5 times. My very, very smart friend and colleague, Angela Bell, who I saw the movie with as we left, immediately as we were leaving the movie theater, pointed out that the use of this phrase, say his name, in this 2021 movie was calling to mind the racial justice movements of last summer, where say his name and say her name were the rallying cries that were said throughout the streets in cities throughout the world. This rallying cry started among activists for Black women's rights, and especially trans Black women's rights, in response to the observation that their killings, their murders, were often forgotten and erased. So say her name or say their names is a plea for visibility, but more than that, it's actually an invocation for a redress of power. Just like in the movie Candyman, it's supposed to be nearly magical to collectively speak a person's name correctly. It's forceful, it's powerful, and it breathes life and existence into a memory. It casts agency and action into the present. So maybe it's not actually so strange to start here with this movie, Candyman, with a ghost story, when we consider that the exhibit creators themselves acknowledge that this exhibit, Unsilencing the Archives, is also telling ghost stories. They're referencing Sarah Irving's work here. And so if we think about the Tel en-Nasbeh archives as a ghost story, and we think about the powerful force of saying names for real substantive change and for giving ghosts a corporeal presence and for provoking change in the present, there are a few moments in this archive, or in this exhibit, I'm sorry, that deserve some closer attention, I think. I was especially struck by the creator's note that the spellings in the archives vary so greatly that it can actually be difficult to even reconcile the names and to produce a consistent, coherent list of the workers' names. I've done similar archival work before, so I know this struggle, especially with people who don't speak Arabic. They'll write down whatever the names sound like to them. And so Mohammeds bleed into Mahmouds. You get nicknames instead of full names. Sometimes you'll get like Ahmed in the blue hat. You get a collection of consonants that don't look anything like any name you've ever heard before. So I know this struggle of like working through these inconsistent spellings. Then the section that follows this comment that the exhibit creators make, I think does an amazing job of identifying individuals with their names and with their photos. It is saying their names in that real and powerful sense. The names are paired with a photo, and when they are paired with a photo, someone like Bakhit Barad becomes a corporeal invocation, the production of the saying the names. In these moments, I think we are looking into the Candyman mirror. But we also see glimpses of how hard it is to actually really be sure that we're even saying the workers' names, even to know the names at all. Not only do we run into the issues of spelling, there's a lot of unevenness. Even in this screenshot, we see Abdul Rahman and Abu Zaid. Those are different ways of referring to a person, where Abdul Rahman would be the person's given name, Abu Zaid would refer to the person's name after they had a son. At least usually, I think. We see lacking full tribal family names. You see just first names used in some cases. In some cases, people are referred to by their status or their role in the dig, like reis, instead of their name. So we see a lot of just unevenness, inconsistency, and like an inability to really be able to say and know any of the workers' full and complete names in any case. On the other hand, as Klein was discussing, the white and foreign archaeologists are very well represented in the archives, and their names are undeniable and undeniably material. They appear not only in photos, but also in signatures. So there are images in the exhibit where you see the signatures of Bade and some others. You even have names of buildings that are named for the white foreign archaeologists. So we have the Fisher House, there's Beit Billy. And so this is, they're not, the names are said, the white foreign archaeologists' names, I'm sorry, I don't know why my PowerPoint is not behaving. Oh, here we are, I'm sorry. So the white foreign archaeologists' names are material, they're given to places, we see signatures, we see them in photos. These names are not just said, they are written, they're inscribed, they're signed, and they are grounded in physical places. The memories of the white foreign archaeologists have always been material. And so that's what I find so exciting about this exhibit. I think it will never be possible, of course, to fully balance the visibility of the workers versus the leaders of this investigation or this excavation or any other one. But this exhibit, I think, invites us to think about the power politics of saying someone's name, of finding the name, of writing a name where there wasn't one before. I think this moment in the exhibit is maybe one of the best ones for talking about this. The curators note that Yusuf Harb is identified in the original caption of this photo as camera boy. He's referred to by what he does, not by his name. So this exhibit, I think, is recognizing that invoking a name isn't just about not forgetting. It's not just about avoiding erasure. It's not just about saying we don't want to forget this person. It's actually about producing power and justice. It's actually a creative act. It's a productive invocation to say someone's name. I think the exhibit asks implicitly what happens if we look into this historical mirror and we say 5 times, Yusuf Harb, Yusuf Harb, Yusuf Harb, Yusuf Harb, Yusuf Harb. What possibilities for justice and change open up in the present day in the physical world when we do something like that? That's all I have to say. Thank you so much for allowing me to be part of this panel.
Well, thank you so much to, oh, sorry, go ahead, Felicity.
Okay, no, thank you, Allison. Again, really interesting to think about the importance of what we're doing and the impact that it may well have to identify, to name these people, to give them that agency and to give them an independence that perhaps hasn't been possible before. That's all. Thanks, Melissa.
Yeah, thank you to all of our panelists. I think everyone has struck part of that same chord that you just talked about, Allison, with trying to find people's names and humanize these records as a form of applying social justice and rectifying the historical record where in the publications, either these people are invisible or are not actually recognized for their contributions or by their name. So there's quite a lot of audience chat happening about making connections between the historical excavations from the 1920s and 30s in en-Nasbeh and the populations of El Bira now, and perhaps descendants of the workers themselves. And this is not something that we've looked into yet. We've only sort of barely begun to even look at the various possibilities. And there are some websites that were recommended that we've perused a bit. And I'm also going to send in one that is part of our future work. It's the elbirasociety.org, which seems like a rich place to start to contact people who are from the Palestinian diaspora living in the United States to ask these questions. But I wanted to ask Dr. Salem if you perhaps have any insight about the descendants of these workers. You gave us more information that I did not know previously about the Malufia family coming from Lebanon. Perhaps you have something to add about the people of El Bira.
Yes, I think oral history is very important for this kind of things. I was able to get in touch because I know somebody from Maluf family from Ramallah. He's a friend of mine. So I just called him and he gave me the information that I provided here. So sometimes you can follow the line. Sometimes it's very hard, but it's not easy because we tried to do it at 2 sites. One of them was Shukra. We are working something in community archaeology with my friend and colleague Brian Boyd there. And we have shown people the photos. We had once done a lecture and there was about something 100 person, unusual in the Palestinian side to have that many. but we show them some picture, and we tried to get reaction from them, whether they can identify the faces that existed at these pictures. But we catch some lines. So it is not easy task. It was not easy for us to do it at Tal with the people who work in 1930s with the Marcus Krauss, but it was easier when we done it with the 1960s excavation. So we have done certain oral history about this time. We just made some recording and taping about their reaction to the experience, whether they know the director, how they acted. So we collected certain stories, but it's not something easy. It's the right place is Albira, but because I tell you what, Albira society is formed by the people who are living in the United States, and some of these guys are still having the old memories. The memory was not lost by time like the people of Albira today said in that existed. I talked once about that. I have my uncle is married to somebody from Albania, and by chance they all land on the side at en-Nasbeh. And one thing I wanted to mention to you, this is common to many archaeologists, when they distributed the inheritance after the father died, they give women share the archaeological site because they are not allowed to build in it, they cannot use it perfectly, etc. So this was the case also at en-Nasbeh, where my uncle's wife own part of the site. So most of the time they were asking me, can we do something about it? I'm sorry, I cannot help you because this is archaeological site. So we have this kind of people who really have certain connection maybe to the site today and during the past. She's now maybe 80, 85 or 90. So they must have existed from people who worked on this excavation. Like Yusuf Harb, we still have a lot of people of Harb family. I don't agree with some argument that all Ramallah people left. Ramallah people left only during the 1920s, not because of Jordanian law or because of etc., because they have a chance to have a second life. And most of them start living after 1970s, 1980s, etc., when they have more people going on. But we still have a lot of people from Ramallah original families. Harb family is very, very famous. We still have Ma'louf family, even he's Lebanese, he's living there. His father was a doctor, of course, medical doctor, so he can go anywhere, but he's still living there. So we have to have names or a picture, and maybe we should do a DNA test at the end, the test to see who are relative.
Thank you so much, Dr. Salem. I think it's time now that we open up to our audience. If there are questions from our audience, or maybe some comments. I know there's been a lively chat session going on, but I believe this is Melissa and Sam. You kind of have the floor for organizing this part of our presentation today.
Yeah, I'm just looking through the audience chat. So I encourage anyone to submit questions either through the chat or through the Q&A. But a question for Allison, since your work has been engaging with more recent projects, I'm curious to hear from you about what kinds of connections you see with these labor systems from the early and mid 20th century and projects in the Middle East now, and how people are treated, how laws have changed, and these types of issues that you've encountered in your work.
Yeah, thanks so much for that question. Yeah, I think like I often make the argument that less has changed than we would hope or we would like. I mean, you can't say that without acknowledging that there are often minimum wage laws that exist now that didn't exist in the past in a lot of countries. And I sort of look at the Middle East broadly as a region. So you see places that didn't have independence, that were under colonial governments in the early part of the 20th century and are now independent. And so some laws have changed there too. But archaeology kind of operates in this strange space in the Middle Eastern region where it's like carved out for itself a lot of legal loopholes or lack of oversight. And so when I connect with like labor scholars in Jordan who are working on other labor sectors, we have much less in common to talk about than I would hope, because archaeology kind of is this weird like informal sector. It's so seasonal. And so it often, people often get away with paying less than minimum wage, or in Jordan, they're required to pay Social Security and health insurance if they're employed for more than, I think, 2 months, I believe is the law. And there are archaeological projects that run for longer than 2 months and they don't pay those things because it is difficult bureaucratically, but it's also the law. And so, yeah, so I think less has changed than we would like, even though there are sometimes laws protecting workers from a lot of exploitative practices. Both culturally, I don't think archaeology has shifted super dramatically. And also there's just a lack of enforcement of those laws that do exist for worker protection.
Thank you. Yeah, that's one of the issues that we only barely touched on in the exhibit, is the contingency of labor, the instability of this kind of labor system when it comes to employing local people. And Sam mentioned a little bit of some of the hiring practices and the politics behind that. So it's, I guess, a little bit discouraging to hear, although it's not surprising either, you know, having worked in the Middle East myself on academic projects, that this system is essentially continuing in slightly different ways. Yeah, Eric, I actually had a question for you next, but I see that you have a comment, so go ahead.
I was just going to jump in and say one of the things that struck me were the labor disputes back then, and how just heavy-handed the Megiddo directors were. I mean, they were, you know, basically like union busting in essence. And that's why some of the Megiddo people went over to en-Nasbeh, is because they just weren't getting, you know, pay raises and such, or not enough. So yeah, the disparity and all that. And somebody mentioned too, the disparity in pay between the women and the children, and even between the Egyptian workmen, according to their status, is just rather amazing in today's terms.
Yeah, there's actually a very interesting collection of letters in the Bade Museum archive between William Bade and Labib Sorial when Sorial was in Egypt. He was sort of the intermediary between the American excavators and the Egyptian foremen in the off season. And so Sorial would say, oh, here's the Egyptian foremen that are coming back from this season. Here's their expected rate of pay. And you almost see him sort of negotiating salary increases almost on their behalf, excuse me, based on how many years they've worked, or citing that fewer are coming back. So the ones that are returning are requiring a bump of this much per month. And so it's very interesting that they had that capability, whereas that sort of negotiation was almost completely absent for locally hired workers.
So there's a question that came in the Q&A from Amber, who is asking about how in the introduction I mentioned that some of the attitudes of the American team were similar to those of other colonial archaeologists at the time, British and European, and she's asking if there were any distinctions between the American team's behavior or attitudes in the field and that of their British contemporaries, or did they try to distinguish themselves from the British teams, or did they seek to diminish differences? And as far as I can tell from the records that we have, and comparing with quite a few recent studies that have come out, many of which are using the PDF archives. For example, Green and Henry's edited volume on Olga Tufnell, and a lot of this will be covered in the upcoming lecture series that we'll be hosting. later this year. But based on those sources that I've read and comparing with the en-Nasbeh archives, I would say that there was not an effort to distinguish the American teams from the British. If anything, there was perhaps an effort to create alliances, especially with this topic of the labor disputes that we're just talking about now, where Bade appealed to the British authorities to help him resolve these disputes and essentially shut down these attempts to get better wages or conditions or certain people hired. And also the British authorities would have ultimate say, as I mentioned, over the leases and the excavation permits. And so we see a codependency between the British government authorities and at least the American team at en-Nasbeh. I don't want to speak more broadly about other American teams, but perhaps Eric, you can comment on this same kind of question and what you found in the archives for Megiddo.
It's a very similar situation, very parallel. I'm actually struck in going through your website and in hearing what you two said this morning. I just parallel after parallel just jump out. And I suppose it's not surprising because Fisher basically taught Bade everything that Bade knew. He came over, he knew nothing. Fisher taught him. In fact, the opening season at en-Nasbeh was started because they took Labib Soriel and Daniel Higgins, the cartographer at Megiddo. They came over with 5 workmen to help the survey at en-Nasbeh. So I wouldn't call it incestuous, but it's getting close. So the parallels are not surprising. In terms of Americans versus British, as far as I can tell, it's very similar, and it's just all very, very, very colonial. So the attitudes that they had, but Americans and British, very similar, I would say.
Yeah, Felicity, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I think that the Mandate period is kind of you can really see the model that was imposed by the British in the way that archaeology was carried out, and it was very efficient. And one thing that particularly John Garstang was very keen on was collaborative projects. So I think that, you know, say for example, Samaria, where you had Harvard University, you had the PEF, you had the Hebrew University, all these agencies, Department of Antiquities, BSAJ, working together. And it's so whilst there is perhaps, you know, some slight differences between the way an American dig would be run as opposed to a British, there's also a lot of collaboration, and it's far more international in that sense than you would perhaps necessarily perceive. But it is always that colonial overprint onto Palestine, rather than it being a collaboration with the Palestinians. I think that's very, very clear.
Yeah, well, one thing that really stands out is perhaps the networks that they each individually belonged to, in which, like Eric just pointed out, there was a close association between a lot of American archaeologists, especially in the mid-1920s, between Bade, Clarence Fisher, and William Albright, sort of centered around the American School in Jerusalem sort of network of archaeologists. Whereas I think a lot of times you see the British archaeologists, R.A.S. McAllister and others, John Garstang, almost being affiliated with the Mandate government itself, coming through the Department of Antiquities and using that as an apparatus to go on these excavations. Slightly different, they're coming from the same background.
Thanks, Sam. I think Eric, you have your hand.
Yeah, let me just.
Perhaps that would be. This will be our last comment, just because we're running short on time, and then I'd like to just say a few concluding remarks, and then we will wrap things up. So
I would just like to point out Rachel Hallett put a comment in the Q&A saying that we need to be wary of being nuanced, and I would completely agree here. en-Nasbeh had one director, it had Bade, but for instance at Megiddo there were 3 directors, one after the other, and the way that Fisher interacted with the Guftis and the local workmen was very different from the way that PLO Guy interacted with them, and then very different again from the way that Gordon Loud interacted. So I think Rachel's comment is well taken. We should be nuanced, and it really does depend on the personality of the dig director and whether or not they have somebody like Labib Soriel as an kind of an intermediary, because he's the one going down to Egypt and really hiring the Guftis that come back. So important not to just lump everybody and tar them with the same brush.
I think Felicity, you also have your hand up, please.
Wait, Felicity, you're muted.
Sorry.
Okay.
What's this? I just want to answer those two other questions that are appearing here. What is the best way for museums to continue to represent or present deserving individuals like the workers to the public? And I think really that depends on what kind of stuff the museums have, which of course varies massively, and also what kind of interests and agendas that the staff have and what they're interested in presenting and how. So of course, and that will vary massively. And on the second one, how do we shift the historical narrative focus from famous discoverer archaeologist to archaeology being an activity and a discipline that takes a lot of effort for many individuals? That's really interesting because it's all a bit Hollywood, isn't it, sometimes? And I think a lot of that depends on how archaeology engages with the media and also how it structures its projects right from the beginning. That idea of community projects, I think, is a really important way to go. We've got to make sure that the community we're conducting archaeology in, that community is invested in that project and is included right from the planning stage.
Thank you so much. And I also want to, first of all, thank all of our panelists for really engaging with this exhibit and bringing in their knowledge and really just for wonderful presentations and discussion. And to our audience, who I can't see, but thank you all for attending. There are a few things in conclusion that I wanted to mention. I believe, if it's not already there, that the link to the website where you can all visit this online exhibit will be in the chat. And also just to mention, if you have friends out there who are interested, or if you want to go back and review any of this, it is being recorded, and the video of today's roundtable will be available on the Bade Museum's YouTube channel. And I believe the link to our YouTube channel will also be placed in the chat if it's not already there. And then finally, again, by way of conclusion, I just wanted to say that this is a wonderful start to a longer program. So coming up in November, we're gonna begin individual lectures on a kind of a similar topic base on archaeological labor in Mandate Palestine and other parts of the Middle East, and also have scholars thinking about questions about, in some ways, excavating archives and considering archives from a post-colonial perspective. And our lecture series will begin on November 4th at 9 a.m. California time, when Sarah Irving, who I know has been a participant in today's, not in the roundtable, but she's been Zooming in with us. Her lecture will be entitled Guarding Archaeology, Everyday Labor in British Mandate Department of Antiquities from Palestine. So please do join us in November. And in the meanwhile, we're still finalizing our list of presenters for the rest of this lecture series. It'll be going from November through June of this academic year. And spread the word, and we hope to see you all there virtually. So again, my thanks to our curators and our panelists and our co-sponsor, the Palestine Exploration Fund, excuse me. And thank you all as an audience for being here, and hope to see you in November. Thank you.